When New York fell apart, 1970s. Imagine stepping into New York City in the early 1970s. The tall skyscrapers were still standing. Times Square was still glowing with neon lights, and the Statue of Liberty still welcomed ships into the harbor. But behind that image of the world's greatest city, New York was collapsing. The economy was in shambles, crime was out of control, buildings were burning every night, the subway was filthy, late, and terrifying, and thousands of middle-class families were fleeing to the suburbs. This was not the New York of dreams. This was the New York of fear, chaos, and decay. For many historians, the 1970s became the darkest decade in the city's modern history. Yet, it was also a time when music, art, and culture exploded like never before. This is the story of when New York fell apart, and how the city somehow survived. Part 1. The economic collapse. To understand the fall of New York in the 1970s, we need to start with money, or more accurately, the lack of it. During the 1960s, New York City was already struggling with huge expenses. The city government promised better schools, public housing, hospitals, and social programs. All of these were important, but they were expensive. By the early 1970s, the bills were piling up. The city was spending more than it earned, and instead of fixing the problem, politicians kept borrowing money. In 1975, the crisis finally exploded. New York City was broke. The government literally had no money left to pay workers or run services. Mayor Abe Beame went to Washington, D.C., and begged the federal government for help. But President Gerald Ford initially refused. Newspapers ran the now famous headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." Although Ford never said those exact words, the message was clear. The federal government wasn't going to save New York. For a while, it looked like the city might actually go bankrupt. Imagine that, one of the biggest, most famous cities in the world shutting down because it couldn't pay its bills. To avoid collapse, New York had to cut services and raise taxes. This meant fewer police on the streets, fewer firefighters, fewer teachers. Garbage piled up, crime got worse, and the sense of decline spread everywhere. The economic collapse didn't just affect government workers, it hit ordinary people hard. Factories closed down. Jobs disappeared. Small businesses struggled. Middle-class families moved away, leaving behind poorer residents. Entire neighborhoods started to empty out. Abandoned buildings became playgrounds for crime and drug use. By the mid-1970s, New York was no longer the shining city of America. It was seen as a symbol of failure, but the economy was only the beginning of the nightmare. Because when you combine money problems with social problems, things get ugly very fast. The crime wave New York in the 1970s became infamous for its crime. Murders, robberies, muggings, and drug-related violence skyrocketed. People were scared to walk alone, especially at night. Tourists were warned to be extra careful, or to avoid certain areas completely. Times Square, which today is full of bright lights and family-friendly shows, was a completely different place back then. In the 1970s, it was full of adult theaters, drugs, and prostitution. The subway was one of the most dangerous places in the city. Trains were covered in graffiti. Lights often didn't work. Gangs would rob passengers. People avoided riding late at night because it simply wasn't safe. New York's image became so bad that newspapers and TV shows across the country used it as an example of urban decay. One shocking fact: in 1977, New York recorded over 1,500 murders in a single year. That's an average of more than 4 people killed every day. It wasn't just murder. Robberies were everywhere. Pickpockets on the subway. purse snatchers on the streets, drug dealers in playgrounds. This constant fear changed the way people lived. Parents didn't let their kids play outside at night. Shops closed early. Tourists stayed in their hotels. The city that never slept was now afraid of the dark. The Bronx is burning. If there is one image that defines New York in the 1970s, it is fire. The Bronx, one of the city's poorest boroughs, became the center of destruction. Night after night, buildings went up in flames. Some of these fires were accidents, but many were set on purpose. Why? Because landlords discovered that it was cheaper to burn down their buildings and collect the insurance money than to keep them standing. As jobs disappeared and tenants could no longer pay rent, landlords saw their buildings as worthless. So they hired arsonists, or sometimes set the fires themselves. The result was a wave of destruction. Blocks of apartment buildings turned into smoking ruins. Families were left homeless. Entire neighborhoods looked like war zones. The most infamous moment came during the 1977 World Series. Television cameras were focused on Yankee Stadium, and in the background, viewers saw smoke rising from fires in the South Bronx. Broadcaster Howard Cosell famously told the nation, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." That phrase stuck. It became a symbol of the city's collapse. But the tragedy was not just the burning buildings. It was the people who lived there, thousands of working-class families, many of them immigrants, who lost their homes, their safety, and their hope. Kids grew up surrounded by rubble, drugs, and violence. Yet, from this same environment, new forms of culture and resilience were born. We'll come back to that part later, but first, let's ride the subway. Subway chaos. If you want to understand the fear of 1970s New York, all you had to do was step into the subway. The subway system, once considered a marvel of modern engineering, had turned into a nightmare. Graffiti covered every surface. Not just little tags, but entire cars painted in wild colors and giant letters. For some, it was art. For others, it was a sign of lawlessness. Trains were late. Stations were late. Dirty. Lights often didn't work. Rats were everywhere. And then there was the crime. Muggings became so common that newspapers joked the subway token should include robbery insurance. Women clutched their purses tightly. Men kept their wallets in their front pockets. Everyone looked over their shoulders. The subway was so dangerous that some people refused to use it at night. Instead, they paid extra for taxis, if they could afford them. In 1979, the Guardian Angels were formed, a group of young volunteers who patrolled subway trains wearing red berets. They weren't official police, but they stepped in to protect passengers and discourage crime. The subway became a symbol of the city itself, chaotic, broken, unsafe, but still moving. Everyday life in a city of fear. What was it like to actually live in New York during this time? For ordinary families, life in the 1970s was a mix of struggle and survival. Middle-class families, especially white families, moved to the suburbs. They wanted safer neighborhoods, better schools, and a quieter life. Those who stayed behind were often poor, working class, or immigrants who had nowhere else to go. In many neighborhoods, buildings were abandoned. Streets were dirty. Streetlights didn't work. Children played in lots filled with broken glass and trash. At night, the city felt dangerous. People locked their doors early. Tourists were warned not to go past certain blocks. Taxi drivers sometimes refused to pick up passengers if they thought the neighborhood was too risky. And yet, life went on. People still went to work every day. Families gathered in tiny apartments for dinner. Street vendors sold hot dogs, pretzels, and bagels on the corners. Local shops tried to survive even as crime and taxes grew. There was hardship, but also resilience. New Yorkers developed a kind of toughness, an attitude that said, "If I can make it here, I can make it anywhere." This toughness became part of the city's identity. The struggles of the 1970s shaped how New Yorkers saw themselves. Survivors in a city that refused to die. But survival was not enough. Something had to give. And in the middle of all this chaos, something unexpected happened. Culture began to rise. Pop culture explosion. In the middle of the city's decline, something unexpected began to grow. Out of the rubble, the fires, and the crime, came music, art, and culture that would change the world forever. Let's start in the South Bronx. In the mid-1970s, young people in poor neighborhoods had almost nothing. No money, no jobs, no safe parks, no after-school programs. What they did have was creativity. Teenagers began experimenting with music in a new way. Instead of using traditional instruments, they used turntables. DJs like Kool Herc, Grandmaster Flash, and Africa Bambaataa invented techniques like breakbeats, repeating the best parts of a record to keep people dancing. On top of these beats, kids started rhyming, chanting, and eventually rapping. They didn't call it hip-hop yet, but that's what it became. Hip-hop was born from the ashes of a burning city. It was raw, powerful, and a voice for young people who had been ignored. But hip-hop wasn't the only cultural revolution. Downtown Manhattan, in abandoned warehouses and clubs, another sound was rising: punk rock. Bands like the Ramones, Television, and Talking Heads played at small venues, like CBGB. Their music was loud, fast, and rebellious, perfect for a generation angry at the world around them. And then there was disco. In nightclubs like Studio 54, people escaped the city's problems by dancing all night under glittering lights. Disco was glamorous, colorful, and full of energy. Street art also flourished. Graffiti artists turned subway cars into moving canvases. Names like Tacky 183 became famous. While many saw it as vandalism, others saw it as the beginning of a new art form. So even as New York seemed to be falling apart, it was also becoming the cultural capital of the world. Hip-hop spread across America. Punk influenced generations of musicians. Disco dominated radio and fashion. Street art laid the foundation for modern fashion. Graffiti and mural culture. The irony is clear. While the city was at its lowest point, it was also creating culture that the whole world would eventually copy. Politics and police. Of course, the city's problems couldn't be solved with music alone. During the 1970s, New York politics was dominated by one word: crisis. Mayor Abe Beame struggled with bankruptcy and massive budget cuts. When he left office, the city was still in chaos. Then came Mayor Ed Koch in 1978. Koch was a colorful, outspoken figure who tried to restore confidence in the city. He was famous for walking around the streets and asking, "How am I doing?" to random New Yorkers. But Koch and other leaders faced a difficult reality. The police force was underfunded, understaffed, and often corrupt. In fact, the Knapp Commission, early 1970s, exposed deep corruption in the NYPD. Many officers were taking bribes, working with drug dealers, or looking the other way. At the same time, police community. Relations were terrible. Minority neighborhoods, especially Black and Latino communities, felt targeted and harassed by the police. Trust was broken on both sides. The city also faced one of its most terrifying moments: the Son of Sam killings. Between 1976 and 1977, a serial killer named David Berkowitz terrorized New York. He shot couples sitting in cars, killing 6 people and wounding 7 others. He sent taunting letters to the police and newspapers, signing them Son of Sam. The fear was so great that women across the city cut their hair short or dyed it blonde, because the killer seemed to target women with long dark hair. When Berkowitz was finally arrested in 1977, relief swept across the city, but the terror of those months added to the feeling that New York was out of control. By the late 1970s, politicians knew that something had to change. More police were hired. Budgets were slowly rebuilt. New programs tried to clean up the city. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was the beginning of a long, difficult recovery. The turning point, late 1970s. By the end of the decade, New York had been through almost everything: financial collapse, crime waves, arson, blackouts, serial killers, and endless bad headlines. But slowly, very slowly, signs of change began to appear. In 1977, New York was hit with one of the most famous blackouts in its history. For 25 hours, the city went dark. In some neighborhoods, especially Brooklyn and the Bronx, looting and arson broke out. Stores were smashed, goods were stolen, and dozens of fires burned. The blackout seemed to confirm everything people already feared about the city, that it was out of control. But paradoxically, it also shocked leaders into realizing how bad things had become. Something had to be done. Mayor Ed Koch pushed for stricter law enforcement, budget discipline, and efforts to restore confidence. Wall Street, which had nearly abandoned the city, slowly started to recover. The federal government, which had earlier refused to help, eventually agreed to loan money to New York under strict conditions. This kept the city running, but also forced it to make painful cuts. Meanwhile, community groups started fighting back. Local activists in the Bronx began rebuilding abandoned lots into community gardens. Volunteers patrolled neighborhoods. Non-profit organizations helped kids with after-school programs trying to keep them away from gangs and drugs. And of course, culture continued to spread. Hip-hop was no longer just a Bronx thing. It was starting to move into Manhattan and then across the country. Punk rock bands were touring nationally. Disco dominated radio charts. In a way, the very things that had been born out of the city's pain were now helping it find new life. From collapse to comeback. So, did New York survive the 1970s? Yes, barely. By 1980, the city was still dangerous, still dirty, and still broke in many ways. But the seeds of revival had been planted. The population of Manhattan began to stabilize. Wall Street's financial industry started booming again, bringing money back into the city. Tourism, though still cautious, started to return. And most importantly, New Yorkers themselves never gave up. The toughness that had been forged during the decade became a badge of honor. People joked that if you could survive the New York of the 1970s, you could survive anything. In the decades that followed, New York would reinvent itself. The 1980s and 1990s brought new challenges: the crack epidemic, the AIDS crisis, continued crime, but also major improvements like cleaner subways, new businesses, and eventually, a dramatic drop in crime. Today, when people visit New York, they see a very different city. Times Square is full of tourists, the subway runs 24/7, and neighborhoods that once burned with arson are now filled with new homes and businesses. But the memory of the 1970s remains. It was a warning of how even the greatest city in the world can fall apart, and a reminder of how resilience, culture, and sheer determination can keep it alive. When historians talk about the 1970s, they often call it the decade of decline. But maybe it was also the decade of survival, because in those years of darkness, New York never truly gave up. And that spirit is what carried it forward into the future. Closing narration. So, when you hear the phrase, "When New York fell apart," remember, it wasn't just about crime, fires, and bankruptcy. It was about people, ordinary New Yorkers, living through fear, finding ways to survive, and creating art and culture that would eventually inspire the world. The city was wounded but not destroyed. It was broken but not defeated. And in the end, New York proved something important. Even when it falls apart, it finds a way to rise again. The 1977 blackout, a city in darkness. On July 13, 1977, lightning struck power lines north of New York City. Within minutes, the entire city went dark. For 25 hours, New York was without electricity. No lights, no subways, no refrigeration, no traffic signals. In a city already struggling with fear and instability, the blackout turned into chaos. In wealthier neighborhoods, people gathered with candles, listened to radios, and waited for the power to return. But in poorer areas, especially Brooklyn, Harlem, and the Bronx, the blackout unleashed something far more dangerous. Looting began almost immediately. Storefronts were smashed, electronics, clothing, and food stolen. Hundreds of shops were emptied in a single night. Fires broke out as arsonists set buildings ablaze. By the time power returned the next day, more than 600 stores had been looted. over 1,000 fires had been reported. Police arrested nearly 3,800 people, the largest mass arrest in the city's history. The blackout became a symbol of the city's desperation. For many Americans watching on TV, it confirmed their worst fears. New York was out of control. But for some, the blackout also sparked creativity. Young kids who stole turntables and sound systems that night went on to become early hip-hop DJs. Out of destruction came music that would change the world. The Son of Sam panic in 1976, New York faced a different kind of terror. A gunman was stalking the city, targeting young couples in parked cars. He struck again and again, killing 6 and wounding 7. The killer left behind strange letters, mocking the police and signing himself as Son of Sam. Newspapers published his words, and panic spread. Young women with long dark hair became especially afraid, since most of the victims fit that description. Beauty salons reported that women were cutting their hair short or dyeing it blonde, hoping not to attract the killers. Attention! Police launched one of the largest manhunts in city history. People were afraid to go out at night. Concerts, parks, and nightclubs saw fewer visitors. Finally, in August 1977, police arrested David Berkowitz, a 24-year-old postal worker, after tracing parking tickets near the crime scenes. The relief was immediate. But the year-long terror had left scars. It showed just how vulnerable the city had become, how fear could paralyze millions of people. Neighborhood struggles. The crisis of the 1970s wasn't the same everywhere. Different neighborhoods experienced it in different ways. The Bronx became the poster child of urban decay. With jobs gone and landlords burning buildings, entire blocks looked like war zones. By 1980, some areas of the South Bronx had lost more than half their population. And yet, this was also the birthplace of hip-hop. The same broken streets where kids dodged crime and fire were the streets where DJs like Cool Herc threw legendary block parties. Harlem, once the cultural capital of Black America, was also hit hard. Poverty and drugs devastated the community. Buildings were abandoned, schools underfunded, but Harlem's churches, jazz clubs, and community leaders kept the spirit alive. Brooklyn faced high crime and poverty in many areas, especially Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant. The 1977 blackout hit Brooklyn particularly hard, leaving scars on local businesses. Yet, Brooklyn also became home to new immigrant communities from the Caribbean and Latin America, who brought food, music, and culture that shaped the city's future. Queens and Staten Island, these boroughs were slightly more suburban and less affected by the worst fires and crime. But they still saw middle-class flight to the suburbs, leaving behind poorer populations. Each borough suffered, but each also contributed to the cultural resilience of the city. Everyday stories of survival. Statistics tell one side of the story, but the real story is about people. A single mother in the Bronx working 2 jobs just to keep her kids fed, even while her building slowly decayed around her. A shop owner in Brooklyn watching his store get looted during the blackout, knowing insurance would never cover the losses. A subway motorman who drove graffiti-covered trains through dark tunnels, never sure if he'd be robbed or attacked on his shift. A teenager who picked up a spray can and started tagging subway cars, believing his name deserved to be seen by millions. A group of friends in Queens who started a garage band that would one day play at CBGB and become part of the punk revolution. These were the real New Yorkers of the 1970s. Survivors, dreamers, hustlers, fighters.